if he'd won this Grand Prix yesterday, let's assume his pit stop had been the same as Oscar's, and let's assume Max wasn't in the race, everyone would be saying, wow, Lando Norris, mega. But of course, what are you comparing him with right now? We're comparing him with Max Verstappen. Monza highlighted and reminded a lot of people of how many small mistakes, small in italics, Lando makes over, say, a 10-lap period, whereas Max doesn't. Yes, of course he makes mistakes. It's not that Max doesn't make mistakes. It's just that when he's braked a little bit too late or he's turned in a little bit too early, he's got a lovely sweet spot in which he can adjust all the variables and get the car still absolutely square to where he wants it to be within a millisecond. Because Lando doesn't drive that way. Everything is on edge. Even though his inputs are soft, everything is as he commits it to be, and then he has to live with that, and then he just has to correct it, and it then becomes a mistake. It slows the car down because it's a glitch on exit, or he's having to move the car more than he should, put more energy through the tires at a specific moment. All those things are shown up at Monza, comparing Lando with Max in cars that weren't that far apart. McLaren had more downforce, the Red Bull more top speed, but it wasn't a commensurate thing. The McLaren had more downforce and the Red Bull had a speed advantage, if you see what I mean. And so Max did a much better job. But if you compared Lando with Oscar, he did a pretty good job all weekend. And yep, he didn't get the pole. And I think that was more, he was beaten by Max, not by Oscar. He still beat Oscar. And I think that was, as I said, if he'd done out of Ascari what Max and George and Charles were doing out of Ascari, I think Lando would have been on the pole. And I am absolutely astonished that his engineers didn't tell him about that, to stick much closer to the white line. When they never seemed to get any better on the areas where Max was doing them. And I was thinking about that this morning, and I suspect the problem comes back to this whole engineering thing and how the cars are engineered and how the drivers are engineered. And the two McLaren drivers can only relate to one another. Well, the engineers only let them relate to one another. That is the overlay. That is the data overlay. And of course, they both are relatively similar in the way they drive. It's not like it was last year at Ferrari, where you had Charles as a mega short corner driver and Carlos Sainz as a very, very good long corner driver, and you had the best of both worlds. You've basically got both of them overlapping all the time, and they're feeding off one another. So if one of them's making a mistake and the other one's basically doing the same thing, that mistake is not going to show up. And that's the problem with engineering today. It's not only McLaren, but we're focusing on McLaren because they have such a great car. But I don't think I've ever heard a McLaren engineer say, Lando, just so you know, Max is doing something different on this corner, and it's nothing to do with the cars. He's just placing the car here and doing it like that. You might want to think about that. It's always Oscar's doing this, or you're up on Oscar here or down on Oscar there. And that's the problem. You know, they don't think laterally. And again, I'm not saying it's just McLaren. I think that's across the board, really, except at Red Bull, where Max is the only thing that matters anyway. And so we had Max doing his thing, you know, very patient, making sure he got the car straight before he really loaded it up, doing really nice mid-corner steering adjustments at turn 1, turn 2, very quick through the Curva Grande, not worrying about being super quick through the Lesmos, just getting a good exit from the second chicane, being very patient going into Ascari to make sure he got the exit perfect for Ascari. And yes, he was coming across to the left quite quickly, but not to the extreme that Lando and Oscar were. And he certainly wasn't doing it on his quickest qualifying laps. In the race, it was somewhat different. And that's one of my points. You know, why weren't they saying to Lando, instead of this ridiculous diagonal that he's doing out of Ascari, why doesn't he do at least what Max is doing out of Ascari? But they didn't. And they just let him get away with it. And every lap, that was probably costing him, I don't know how many revs, but 50 revs, 60 revs coming out of Ascari probably. You may think, well, that's not very much, but it's enough to justify the difference between the pole and P2. But yeah, Lando is what he is. I don't think he's going to get a lot better than this. I think that's what he is. You know, he's very soft on inputs. He's very rhythmic on street circuits when he's got lots of changes of direction. He's very good there. He gets into a groove quite well. But he's always having to correct very small mistakes. Whereas Max makes errors that don't require correction. They just require adjustment. There's a difference between correction and adjustment. Except, of course, when he's on cold tyres at a restart in Barcelona, or he's on the sand on full tanks at the beginning of the Dutch Grand Prix. That's when you could say it's an error, and Max is all about car control then and reflexing. And Oscar falls somewhere between the two, in my opinion. Yeah. But he hasn't enhanced the Max side of his capability enough this year. I think he's too much. It's a function of everything he does is kind of related to what Lando's doing, and therefore they've both gone down the same path of relatively wide approaches and corrections rather than adjustments.